He was somewhere large and indoors. A vaulted ceiling stretched high overhead. A cup was steered into his hands. Delmare took it thankfully and blinked to clear his eyes. "When do you expect the knights back among us?" Thorbolt asked as Delmare choked on the fiery red wine he'd just been given. Thorbolt thumped him between the shoulders without sparing him a glance. The cowed man shrugged. "They're on their way back already," he replied. "The time for swords has passed, and the affair needs my attention now, it seems." And without another word, he vanished. Delmare choked again. Thorbolt looked at him disgustingly. "Never seen a wizard teleport before? Have you any backbone to you at all, man?" The grand chamber seemed suddenly very empty. Only a faint odor of pipe smoke hung around them to mark that Elminster had been there. Elminster the sage, greatest archmage of Dragonreach. Delmare stared around in wonder until Thorbolt hauled him to his feet, took hold of his chin and shook. When Delmare's eyes refocused, Thorbolt growled at him. "For all that? Good, come, arms await you. Of a task I need done and all my men are already spoken for." They went out together in haste. Delmare clutched at Thorbolt's arms as they went. "Excuse me, lord, but—" "Thorbolt spun. If you live longer, lad, never grab me by my sword arm." Those cold, grey eyes bored into Delmare's. "What do you want?" My lord," Delmare said, gathering his dignity. "I'm Delmare Rallyhorn. I've come from Cormyr to speak with Elminster the Sage on an important private matter. Family business, you see. I'm of noble birth, and would speak with Lord Morgrim. He is expecting me." He stopped. Thorbolt was already nodding and turning away. "Aye, I know. Elminster told me. Well met, lad. I fought beside Rallyhorns. If your business was so urgent, you had your chance to speak to him. Now I can wait until tonight, after the foolery's done." But, Thorbolt cast an eye and looked back over his shoulder. "Come," he said, and strode away. "The old mage also told me it'd be good for you to wait for your audiences and do some honest work for a change. Noble birth, huh? You know one end of a table apart from the other?" He strode on. "Or a sword?" Aelith eyed the pavilion warily. It stood closest to the frowning grey walls of the tower, and as far as she could tell, in the press of the crowds and amid the false tents, flagpoles, and pavilions, it was the only white one with green trim. It was small, but a young man in chainmail stood guard outside it, leaning on a large drawn sword that gleamed point down on the turf before him. The girl approached hesitantly. The eye of the guard regarded her warily. The man shifted his grip to hold the sword properly, and Aelith saw that he was sweating. "Yes?" It was a challenge. "Why you come here?" The Lord Morgrim sent me," Aelith replied. The pain in her side had subsided to a dull, incessant ache, and her feet were less steady. Somehow the laughter and the chatter of the crowd seemed to rise and fall like waves on the shore of Moonsea. She eyed the guard through fresh tears of pain. Abruptly he nodded. "Pass within, lady. You are expected." Aelith nodded and stumbled past him to an entry of interleaved hangings. There was a light within and 3 roped women. They looked to her and one reached out a hand in polite greeting. "Well met," she began in a low, pleasant voice, but Aelith could not seem to reach that hand. She reached and reached, stretching out shaking fingers to a sudden roiling mists. The world roared and bubbled in her ears, and that hand still seemed impossibly far away. "In time, thank Tymora," Rathan said eagerly as they thundered over the bridge at full gallop, the guards hastily leaping out of the way and trying to salute at the same time. "Thank rather your sword's swift steed," Flowen replied dryly. "And we'd best turn aside into the meadow, blades, or we'll plow right into the back of the parade." The knights of Myth Draenor had ridden hard since the grey fall dawn, their mission done. A Zentaran wizard lay dead in his captives. Among the last of Rendell's Maul's folk of Daggerdale, safe in the hands of King Alzon of Cormyr, and a purple dragon patrol from Tilford's Gap. Spells had been laid upon them, but Elminster would have to deal with that. The old mage would no doubt be with Morgrim, guarding him this day among the festival crowds. Florin guided his charger, Firefoam, through a maze of tents towards the paddock at the back of the tower used by the knights. On the way he noticed with surprise that Cheryl's pavilion was up, erected near at hand. He pointed behind him, the other knights nodded. Among them Jesiel stiffened in her saddle. magic in that tent," she hissed as they entered the paddock in a welter of hooves and flying mud. "Charles?" Florin asked, leaping from his saddle. Fireflame politely stepped out of the way as Josiah's mount slithered to a less graceful stop. The sorceress nodded grimly. "We'd best go see." "Oi, I haven't even found a tankard yet," Rathan protested. The stout cleric rolled out of his saddle to splash heavily into the mud, feet first. The nearest of the knights, Tom, had already stepped well back in wise expectation. His eyes rolled and said, you will, I fear not." Rathan gave him what is sometimes called a horse look and said, "Well, I haven't yet, and it's been a long ride." "Let's be quick, then," Florin replied briskly over his shoulder as he strode towards the white and green pavilion. A young man in chainmail stood before the tent, lifting his drawn sword warily at their approach. He wore no livery, and Florin, who knew every guard, horse and war dog in the dale, had never seen him before. The battle leader of the knights did not slow. His blade flashed out. "How now? What's this? Identify yourself, man, and who is within?" The sword came to meet his fast enough. "You shall not pass, none more pass." "By whose order?" Florin inquired coolly, striking the blade from the man's hand with a twist of his wrist. Desperately the man reached for his dagger, but Tom was already plunging past him towards the pavilion. He grasped the guard's descending wrist at the hand it was attached to reach the dagger and pulled sharply downwards. The man fell helplessly, and Rathan's foot came down on the dagger. A scant before the second of weight of Rathan's formidable behind came down on the guard's chest. "Suppose ye tell me some things," the priest began. "While my fellow knights barge rudely into the Lady Charles' pavilion and discover for themselves what's going on. Answer carefully, mind. Thy continued well-being might deep upon the probability of thy tongue." The guard's muffled reply was lost to the other knights as they ducked swiftly through the hangings, keeping low and with weapons out. Inside were two astonished robing mistresses, the usual wardrobe stands and racks, and in front of them a frightened girl, half in and half out of one of Charles' fine gowns, white to the lips and holding a sword that was too heavy for her, its points wavering menacingly in that direction. "Back, zent villains!" she said, in a voice that trembled only a little. Her eyes darted back and forth from one intruder to another as her forearms trembled with the weight of Morgrim's ornate ceremonial sword. "Back, I said," she snarled, "or I'll call out the knights of Myth Draenor upon ye." Florin stared at her for a moment and smiled. Very slowly he sheathed his sword and spread his gloved hands. "Good lady," he said, bowing low, "we are the knights of Myth Draenor. How may we serve thee?" Tongues were still aflutter all over the great feast hall in the Tower of Ashaba as the third remove of the feast came. Servants brought out decanters of wine and rolled out fresh kegs of beer to the accompaniment of general cheers. The usual high spirits and boastful stories of feats of arms reigned in the smoke-filled hall. But again and again Arts darted to the young girl seated in the place of honor beside the Lord of Shadowdale. She wore one of the Lady Cheryl's older, smaller gowns, but looked tired, pale, and a little scared. Save when she spoken to, she sat looking down at her lap and eating a little. The Lady of the Feast is a position traditionally filled by the Lady of the Dale. In Cheryl's absence, and in the lack of the Dowager Dale, Lady of the Dale, it should have gone to the Shadowline of the Tower, but a seal with her lady, and left it to the Under-Shadowlane, who was not popular with the folk of the Dale. Yet when the ceremonial drawn sword had been carried into the hall, naked and aloft by the knights of Myth Draenor, in their fiery and bearing torches, this young unknown girl had walked at their head, the single candle of a maiden glimmering in her hands. Who was she? Was Morgrim planning to take her to wife? What did this mean? Olindia glowered at the newcomer for a low table. There was much mirth at her red face and dagger-like lenses. Some said they knew the girl. She was a daughter to one of the roving seasonal workers who came to lift the mill each spring. Aelith was her name. Others said she must be Morgrim's daughter, kept secret until now and brought out of Cheryl's absence to spite her and her new baby. Still others whispered that she was Cheryl's secret daughter, born out of wedlock in an affair among the nobles of Cormier and sent here by Cheryl from wherever in the Forest Kingdom she had the children hidden away all these years. She was perhaps 10 years old, although solemn and reserved in bearing. And who was she really? The contest had gone well, with much color and skill to all the ladies and make the old men shake their heads in admiration. Not as good as in their day, mind, but worth seeing. All the same, and the best to be sure of these last 30 winters or so, the Lord Morgrim had promoted 6 warriors to be officers of various ranks and recruited over 40 new guards from the lads and maids who'd competed in the contests. Now he was sharing out of the bounty of the Shadowdale, season free from Zentif's attacks. Much good, roasted game and stock, rivers of beer, and copious fine wines from all across the north. It had been a good day. They dined in the hall was terrific. Half a dozen lesser minstrels were desperately trying to impress the bard Storm Silverhand. Resplendent in warriors' leathers and gleaming new boots, who sat in a seat at one end of the hall, the candles on the tables and overhead danced reflections from 1,000 goblets and decanters, and sparkled on score of bright polished gorgets, pectorals, and wrist bracelets. Precious stones, furs, and shimmering skills fought for attention, and folk of the dale and all who could find time and excuse to stop in Shadowdale for the night had worn their most proud and unrestrained finery. Soon the dancing would begin. Florin's trained eyes found a worried-looking woman bending over Orlindia, talking earnestly, and looking from time to time at the high table. The ranger shot another glance down at the table at Aelith. Her brow was furrowed. Pain? She was still hurting, despite the healing spells she'd received before the knights had come upon her. He looked around, and his eyes fell on the young god who'd been set to protect the pavilion, this Dalma. His eyes were on no one but the girl, and he had the tender, yearning look of a youngling in the full thrall of his first love. Florin shook his head slightly and looked back at Aelith. Yes, something is wrong. His eyes encountered those of Thunball, and at the other end of the high table, and they exchanged looks. The captain of arms, too, had seen that something was amiss. Florin cleared his throat to say something and drew his booted feet up under him to rise from his place. And the girl rose like a white flame flickering suddenly up from a dry log, curtsied at Morgrim with a warrior's speed, and was gone. Out one of the side of the doors of the hall, Florin rose to follow without delay. A hand took his elbow, and from behind, while he was still whirling his chair onto place, Florin saw Olindia leaving the hall in haste with the woman she'd been talking with. As he turned to look back, Morgrim stood behind him. "Thanks, Lord Florin," the Lord of Shadowdale said softly. "But this is my mess to attend to. I feel like I'd seen it alone. If you could take my place in the toast and such like." Florin nodded and clapped Morgrim on the back. "Of course. Go then," was all he said. He took the Lord's seat, shaking his head at Thunball in silence, motioning the captain back to his seat. The Lord of Shadowdale hurried out of the feast hall into the candle-lit quiet of the rest of the tower.